Yeah, so this is tutorial 2. I guess Brandon did tutorial 1 with you guys, which was HTML and CSS. So this is the next installation in the web dev tutorial and the web dev tutorials. So yeah, so let's just get started. I think we have enough people joined. Yeah. Yeah, okay, so let's get started. So first, like before I get into like things like syntax and JS concepts, I'm just sort of going to give like a little intro as to why you're learning JS right now and why it's important. So basically, JavaScript at its core is mainly used by web browsers to create dynamic and interactive experiences for the user. Essentially, most of the sites or applications that you use every day are coded in some form of JavaScript, like for example, anything from like YouTube to Notion, even Google Docs that I'm using right now for this presentation, even OnQ, like something like OnQ, it's all JavaScript that makes it interactive. And so, especially when you get to learning front-end frameworks like Vue, Angular, Ember, React, etc., you'll be working in JavaScript to really enable the interactive part of your application, which is really the core part of the application aside from just the visuals. And so, yeah, I guess for now, just think of JavaScript as the tech that allows us to interact with a web application or a web page. And also just bear with me, I'm really sick right now, so I can't really talk too well right now, so yeah, just bear with me. So yeah, just another second intro to JS would just be to let you guys know that JS is a loosely typed and dynamic language. What that means is that variables are not directly associated with any type. So like if any of you guys have used something like Java before, maybe in like Sys124, you may have noticed that when you define variables, you need to give a type. Like for example, you need to give integer like int, bool, string, str, something like that, right? And so in JavaScript, it's similar to Python in the sense that you can change the type of a variable at will, and you don't need to declare the type right away when you first make the variable. And yeah, so now let's just get into the basics. So in JavaScript, we have primitive data types, which are, let's start with number. So if you use something like Python or Java, you may have noticed that we have like data types like float, double, things like that. In JavaScript, we just have a general type called number, which encompasses everything from like floats to integers. There is also a type called big int. You probably won't need to really do anything with that. So just keep in your mind right now that it's a number is the data type for numbers, for all numbers in JavaScript. And then the rest of them are just like string, which is pretty self-explanatory, Boolean, which is true or false. And then we have a null type and an undefined type. And I won't get I won't get too deep into that, but basically an undefined type is, an undefined type arises when you declare a variable, but you do not give it any sort of value. Like you just say, let variable name, like let variable one, let X, something like that. And then if you try to access it, it'll be undefined because you haven't actually defined a value for it, but you've declared it. And I think that's a bit different. Like, I don't think there's anything like that in Python. So I think that's probably new for most of you. And yeah, now let's get on to defining a variable. So there are 3 ways to define a variable in JavaScript. I hope you guys can see my IDE on the right. I'll quickly sort of walk you through it as I do it here. So you can use let. So you can do something like let name equal a string, not put that in. You can also say const name. Also semicolons are optional in JavaScript. Thought I'd mention that as well, because they are not optional in something like Java. And then the third way is with var. So like that. And so yeah, these are the 3 ways you can define a variable in JS. I will now just give you sort of the important context as to like what's the difference between let, const, var. And this has to do with block scope. And if you've like coded in Python or Java before, you probably are familiar with the concepts of like local scope, global scope, like which defines where you can access a variable. Essentially, the gist of it is that with let and const, you cannot create variables that are scoped to the entire function, but rather when you use let or const, it scopes the variable to the block. And when you use var, you can actually use those variables inside the entire function body. Even if you've defined that variable inside a block of code, you can use it outside of that block of code. So it's a little bit more global, you could say, than with let or const. And I'll just give you a quick example. I think I have a quick example here. Actually, sorry, I don't have an example for that, but yeah, if anybody is wondering about that, just ask me later. It's just a matter of function scope versus block scope. And yeah, so sorry, that's a bit confusing, but moving on, we have objects. This should be a bit more simple. You may have used like Python dictionaries before. Objects in JavaScript are very similar. You just have key value pairs. So here we have a example of a JavaScript object. The keys are the first part of the pair. So we have key 1, which corresponds to value 1, and key 2, which corresponds to value 2. So this is like directly like one-to-one what you would see in something like Python. Similarly, in JS, yeah, sorry, I already said that. This is basically, this code here is an example of sort of showing how we can define an object in 3 different ways. So the first of which is just straight up saying, const car equals, and then we give it the different attributes. Like we have a type, we have a model, we have a color. These are the different attributes, and we actually link the attribute or the key to a value. And the second way we can do that is using the object constructor. And don't get too caught up on like constructors or anything like that yet. Just know that you can create a object using the object constructor. You probably don't need to do this. Like I don't think I've ever done this. I just thought I'd mention that there are different ways to do this. And oftentimes in JS, there will be different ways to do a lot of things. Like, for example, once we create this car object, say we want to access the type, like say we want to print out the type of the car. There's 2 different ways to do it. We can say car and then use the square brackets with the attribute inside of it, or you can just use the period and say car.type. So these are 2 exactly similar, same ways of doing the same thing. And so like now that I've described objects, it goes hand in hand with arrays. And so I'm pretty sure like everybody here, if you've programmed before, like you've used an array before, or maybe you're more familiar with lists in Python. I'll just walk through this example. Basically, to define an array, you just, once again, you use either let, const, or var, then you use a variable name, and then you use the square bracket notations for an array. And you can just put the values directly in there, or you can maybe set it like empty, like this, and then, go and manually add things into the array. Pretty self-explanatory. Goes back. And one thing I would like to mention with arrays is you will oftentimes find yourself having to like iterate through an array and do something with the objects in that array. And so you might be thinking like, oh, why don't we just use a for loop? You can use a for loop, and that's probably the way you're most used to if you haven't used JavaScript before. And it's perfectly fine to use a for loop, but it's a bit more common to see the map function being used. And the difference between like a for loop and the map function is that map will actually, using the function you provided, and it will spit out a new array. So that's the difference between that and a for loop. And yeah, just to walk through this example, we have this array 1, which stores 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, which are all numbers. And what we can do is we can make a new variable called map1, and we can map through the array. And for each element x, we can multiply x by 2. And so that's sort of what's going on in here. The syntax might look a bit confusing to you, but it will make a bit more sense when I describe the different ways of defining functions in JavaScript. So this is a arrow function. I think this is like also called a lambda function in Java. I might be wrong, but this is like more or less the same thing. Like you take a variable and you just directly define what the operation is you're doing to that variable. And we do that for each variable in this array. And then if we were to log this variable, this new map variable, we get the resultant array. And obviously these are wrong because I changed the values in here. So don't worry about these values. Yeah, moving on, like now that I've described objects and arrays, we can sort of bring them together with an example that shows like how these two concepts sort of are very are very related, and you will use them together very often. And so this example I have is just it's a very simple example. I just have a playlist variable, which is an array. It's a simple array. And what I do is I use the push function, which is a built-in function for arrays. And what I'm doing is I'm pushing an object. So I just described the object syntax a few moments ago. And what I'm doing here is I'm just pushing this object onto the array. And so what you can see is that we have a title, which is summer playlist, and we have a number of songs attribute, which is 60. And these are just arbitrary values just for the sake of the example. And so, yeah, we push this first playlist onto the array, and then we push the second playlist onto the array. And then we bring it all together with the map function. And essentially, we say that we want to map through the playlist array one by one. And for each playlist, we want to do something with that playlist. And so inside of these braces, what I think this should have been like curly braces. Pretty sure this should have been curly braces. I'm not sure. But yeah, inside of this function, we want to just define what we want to do with each playlist. And so in this example, we're just logging the title. So once again, I showed how we can access a attribute of an object. So basically, we're accessing this title object. And so if I were to put this in my console and I were to actually map through this array, we would get summer playlist, and then we would get hip hop tracks. So we would get one after the other. We would get both of those titles out of this array. And I think this is a bit of like this is very fundamental, because when you start using like React and you try to really make something dynamic, you're gonna oftentimes find that you need to iterate through a collection of something and basically do something. Like, for example, this might be a bit unfamiliar, so don't worry too much about that. But I think, say you want to iterate through like a array of playlists and create like a React component or something like that for each playlist. You will need to use exactly what I'm showing you here. Like you need to use the map function. You need to map through the playlist. Inside of these braces, you would probably like define a React component, and then we would define a component for that many items in the playlist. And so, yeah, I'm just stressing that right now that this is a pretty important concept, arrays and objects. And yeah, so just moving on from that, we have functions. Basically, there are a lot of ways of defining functions in JavaScript. So don't get too worried if like you were like jumping between different ways of doing functions. Like even I jump between like arrow functions to anonymous functions to like standard functions. Like there's so many different ways of doing things, and you might forget. So at the end, I'll link some resources just so you can always search it up whenever you're drawing a blank or anything like that. But yeah, so for functions, there are a few different ways. I'll start with I think the most common way, which is just using the function keyword. And so if you use something like Python, it's just like the def, like def, then the function name, then the curly parentheses, the normal parentheses, and then, the logic. In JavaScript, it's a bit different. We use this function keyword, identifier, and then inside we can take the arguments here, just like that. And this is different from like something like Python in the sense that we need these curly braces to store our logic in. And yeah, so this is the first way. The second way is slightly different, and this is called an anonymous function. Basically, it's the same thing as the first one, but we're just storing the function inside of a variable. And so if you look closely, you'll see that we're not actually giving a name to this function. We're giving a name to the variable. So this do something variable will contain the function. Moving on to arrow functions, which is maybe this is the most common way. I know I said the other way was the most common, but oftentimes you will see arrow functions. And if you're wondering why it's called arrow functions, is it because we have the equal sign and the arrow? So yeah, so this is going to get a little bit like nitty gritty, but just bear with me as I like go over the specific sort of cases that you may encounter with arrow functions. So basically, if you're defining an arrow function and there are no parameters, like you don't need to pass anything into this function, you just want to run it, you need to have these open and closed parentheses. The second case is if we have exactly one parameter, we can actually omit the open and closed parentheses. And so here's an example of that. Like say we just have this one argument called arg. Let's make it more descriptive. Like let's say argument y. We don't need to actually have these open closed parentheses. We can just remove them and we can just directly go to the function body. And so here we would put expression 1, expression 2, etc. And the third case is if there's exactly one expression in the function body. And when I say expression, I mean like an expression, if you don't know what that is just a line of code that pretty much like does something or spits something out, right? And so calculation is a great example of that. Adding a plus b is a expression. And so say all we want to do is add a plus b, we don't need to have these curly braces. We can just directly say a plus b. And then the fourth and final thing I would like to mention about use cases for arrow functions is whenever you have more than one expression in the function body. And this is basically just implied by the previous example. You need the curly braces when you have multiple expressions. And also you need the return statement. So you can't just say a plus b. You need to say, return a plus b if you're actually doing something with a or b prior to the return. So yeah, there's just a bunch of different like ways of doing this. So just keep that in mind when you're working with arrow functions and you should be fine. And yeah, just moving on, I would like to sort of touch on like the difference between the functions and methods. You might be confused with that. Like, okay, in Java, we like to call, functions that are defined on instances, like instance methods. You can also call it like a function. It's more or less the same thing, but I just want to highlight that we can actually store functions inside an object. So here you see we have this object called person, and we have two different key value pairs. The first of which is name, which is Max. I actually got this from a Udemy course, so maybe some of you guys already did JS before, and you sort of recognize some of these examples. I thought it was super helpful, so I'm sort of teaching from there. But that's besides the point. Basically, we have this name which maps to Max, and we have greet which maps to an entire function. So this is important because we can actually take this object and we can access the attribute like we've done before, but this time the attribute is actually a function. So we can directly call that function from the object. And I've done it right here with person.greet. And I think this is a good time to mention that comments in JS are used with the double forward slash as opposed to something like a number sign, like something like this. Maybe you've seen in Python. In JavaScript, we use the double forward slash. And yeah, I think I went over a lot of stuff. Hopefully, I didn't go too quickly. May have not been the most exciting stuff since it's just that you will probably end up looking up like a million more times from now. So yeah, I just want to open the floor to anybody to see if you have any questions about anything I just mentioned. Okay, I guess we don't have any. I can't really. Oh, okay. Okay, yeah. Is there a reason for using one type of function declaration over another? That is a good question. I mean, there definitely probably is. Um, yeah, there definitely probably is, but I think like for the scope of this tutorial, it's not really too important. Like whether you use an arrow function or like a function with a function keyword, um, it should be more or less no different, but difference. But yeah, I'm not exactly sure off the top of my head like what's the benefit, but I'm sure there is if you want to look into that further. Um, when would I store a function in a variable? I think I'm pretty sure a time when you would need to store a function in a variable. And this is sort of like skipping ahead a bit into events, but it has to do with callback functions and the fact that like if you have an event listener and you don't want to directly call a function that you give to an event listener, you can give like a function identifier. And an easy way to do that is just storing the function in a variable and then giving the name of the variable to that event listener as an argument. And if that doesn't make sense now, like I will show an example once I get to the next couple of slides, because I'm going to explain event handling, and it'll make a bit more sense then why that's important. Okay, and I see another question saying, is basic loop structure in JS similar to Java? I will get to that literally right after this in like 2 slides. So just hang on, I will get to that in a moment. Any more questions? Nope. Okay. Okay. Yeah, I'll just move on then. Yeah. Okay. So, yeah. So now, just moving on to control structures. This should be super easy and super familiar with you guys if you've coded before. We'll just start with like if statements, and this sort of ties in with Callum's question, like, you know, like, oh, are basic loop structures in JS similar to Java? Yes, they are, and so are if statements. A lot of the control structure stuff is similar to Java, and specifically, you can see that in the way we define this. Like, we wrap the condition in open and closing parentheses. We have curly braces in which we store the expression body. Those are the two like biggest things. And I actually have an example of Python. So you can see this is very obviously not similar to Java or JS in the sense that we don't need to wrap the condition in these open and closing parentheses. And we don't need to have these curly braces after the control structure. We just need to have the semicolon. And yeah, so that's pretty much if statements, pretty straightforward. Moving on to for loops and while loops. And this will answer your question, Callum. Like, in this example, we just define a variable called c, and now we say while c is less than 10, and then in the curly braces, we do something. So what we do in this case is just increment c by 1. And for the for loop, this is actually a little bit different than something you may have seen in like Python, in the sense that we actually increment the iterator variable inside of the sort of first line of the for loop. And so in this example, we actually define C, and then we give the condition for termination, and then we give the condition for like incrementation. And I think this should be pretty self-explanatory. Like, you define the variable that you want to use for iterating. You define like when do you want it to stop. Well, we want it to stop when C is no longer greater than less than 10. And in order to move that variable on, we need to increment it by 1. And similarly, you can do something like decrement it by 1. You can do like minus equals. You can even do times equals, like times equals 2, something like that. But yeah, this is generally pretty similar to Java, if I'm not mistaken. That wraps up sort of the what I'd like to say, like the parts of JS that is very core and similar to across all programming languages. And now I'd sort of like to get into the DOM, which is a JS specific thing. You won't see anything like this in like Java, Python. Like, this should be new to a lot of you guys, even if you've done JS before. So yeah, so let's get into this DOM stuff. So yeah, so essentially to understand the DOM, and this is a bit hard to explain, but the first thing you want to know about the DOM is that there are essentially the DOM is essentially created and populated with nodes. And so the root node that is exposed to us by the DOM, and you could essentially think of it as the topmost entry point, is the document. So that's literally just the keyword document. And there's also the window, which is a sort of like second layer under the document. So you have the document and then you have the window. And this will make more sense when I show you the console. But essentially, these two DOM nodes give us access to all the other HTML that's going on in our web page behind the scenes. And so here's a sort of, actually first I'll show you this sort of example. I don't know how clearly you can see this, but yeah, basically I'm sure like most of you guys have like done inspect element before, and you've seen this sort of a jumble of HTML like code inside of the elements part of the DevTools. And I'm pretty sure Brandon would have explained to you guys DevTools in the last tutorial. But essentially, if you go to DevTools and the Elements tab, you can see this big sort of jumble of HTML. And so if you look closely, you can see that it's basically structured in like a tree-like format. Like you can click on a div, and then when you click on it, it'll expand into like a bunch of children elements. And then those elements, maybe you can expand into more children elements, and so on. So if you look at this picture, you can understand how it's sort of a tree-like structure, where we start with a document, and then we go down to the HTML tag, and then it sort of branches off into a bunch of other things like head, body. And sort of just to solidify this, you can sort of hopefully see that there's parent-child relationships, like for example, between body and H1, right? H1 is the child of body. And there's sibling to sibling relationships. Like you can see that HTML is a parent to both head and body. So they're sort of on the same horizontal level, whereas a parent-child relationship is more on like the vertical level, right? And yeah, I think that should be that should really help you understand like what the node is, like geometrically, you could say, like how you could visualize it, how you could visualize the structure of it. And so I'm just going to go through I'm going to show you guys like a quick little JS app that uses HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. But before that, I just want to show a quick example of how the DOM actually works. So for that, I will just pull up this page. I hope you guys can see this. Essentially, I'm going to go to the console, and I will sort of show you how we can grab parts of the HTML page. Like we can go directly into the HTML, into the DOM, and we can go and like grab things, and we can do things to it, right? We can manipulate it. And so to start with, I want you to just shift your attention to the Elements tab that I have open right now. And so you can see how we have this HTML tag, which if you look at the slideshow is sort of this part, HTML. And if you see, if you look closely, you can see how it branches off into head and body. And so this graph that I have on the slide is literally what you're seeing here in the Elements tab. I hope that's clear. And so, yeah, so the example I sort of wanted to show was, if we go into console, we can do a variety of things. And if you refer to this slide, I have a section called querying elements. And so, maybe you have a question like, oh, what if we want to go and like grab something specific from this calculator webpage? Well, let's see what we can grab. Let's go to the body and let's take this tag called section. And if you look closely, this section tag has an ID. And there is one specific way of getting an element from the DOM directly. And that way actually uses the HTML. And so in our console, I just did this before this tutorial, so it should be saved in here. Essentially, what I'm going to do is say var element equals document.getElementById, and we're going to pass the ID in. And so if this isn't immediately clear to you, what I'm doing is I'm defining a variable called element, just a generic variable called element. And in order to get the element, once again, we need to start with the root node that is exposed to us, which is called document. And on top of that document object, we need to access the get element by ID function. And this function essentially takes an ID, which is a unique identifier of an HTML element in the DOM. And if you look closely here, unfortunately, I can't highlight it, but this line that I have clicked on, you can see section ID equals calculator. Essentially, this unique ID called calculator, we're just directly using here as an argument to this function. And if you say element now, you will see that it'll spit back out to us this HTML element. So this is like a start to finish example of like of having an element in the DOM and then querying it, getting access to it directly. And there's some more things we can do, like once we define that element, or actually, sorry, let me go over another query selector. Sorry, another way of querying elements, and then I'll give you an example there. So say we want, so that was one way with IDs. Now say we wanted to grab an element by the actual HTML tag itself. So instead of saying, hey, we want the tag that has, we want the element with the calculator ID, let's say we want the tag that is a section tag. So what we can do for that is the same exact thing, but instead of get element by ID, we can use the query selector function. And what this function takes is it essentially takes the name of an HTML tag. So I'm sure you guys are familiar with things like body, maybe you're familiar with H1, H2, like for headers. You can use those two, like H1, H2. There's an HTML tag called section defined here. And so I'm just using that for the sake of example. And so essentially I'm just passing that keyword section. And so what that does is it finds the first HTML element that is a section, and it stores it in the section variable that I've created. And the example that I wanted to show that I had before was that we can say section.style.color equals white. And when you do that, and now I go back to the HTML, we can actually see that a style attribute is now applied to that HTML element. So essentially what I've done is I've gone and I've grabbed that node out of the DOM, and I've directly mutated some CSS property on it. And so, yeah, that just sort of should give you a good example of how you can really get down like really deep into each element and sort of manipulate every single thing in the web page that you can see. I will note that like you probably are not going to even do this, so don't like stress too much if it's confusing. I don't think like I've really ever done this, since I don't use like vanilla JS when I build applications. If you use React, which you probably will start learning React first, you're not really going to need to do manual DOM manipulation, because React has something called a virtual DOM, which I will get into in the next tutorial. But yeah, don't stress too much about like the specifics about like querying elements. Before I made this tutorial, I actually had to go back and refresh myself on a lot of this stuff, since I don't directly use it on a day-to-day basis. But nonetheless, it is pretty foundational, like to understand how, like what you're looking at when you see this elements tab, like how you can go into the console and directly grab an element, everything like that. It is pretty important to know. So yeah, just moving on from that. And yeah, this slide pretty much just showed the example I went over, where we had a tag, we selected it with the query selector, then we changed some CSS property. So yeah, and just my final slide before my demonstration is just to sort of show you an introduction to events. And so like, just before you do anything, like if you just look at this web page that I'm on right now, I'm on Google Docs. Say you look at anything, like for example, the share button. If you pay attention, like in the top right, you can see this little orange share. Yeah, for example, like behind the scenes, there could be an event listener waiting for me to click on this button before it actually does something. And like this is something that's often confusing when people learn, like when people start to question like, oh, what does interactive mean? Like just this website without the JavaScript is just a website. Like you can't click on anything. It won't really do anything when you click on anything. There's no logic. But with this share button, say we have an event listener behind the scenes, it can actually store a bunch of logic that we can execute when a certain event happens. And so on the left, I sort of have a bunch of different events. I have on change, on click, on mouse over, on mouse out. You can easily search up in the documentation a bunch of different JavaScript events. So yeah, don't worry about like memorizing anything. I just want to show that there are a bunch of different events that you can directly access. And this code example here is just to show you how we can grab a button from the DOM and attach an event listener to it. And so don't worry like at all about this code. Like don't even look at this code. It's just here for the sake of the example. But basically this is a function that adds two numbers together. That's all you need to know for this example. Like this function adds two things together. And the whole point of this example is that we use this selector, which I just showed an example of in the console, where we get the element by ID and we give a specific ID. It actually pulls that HTML element into JavaScript, so we have access to it. And now what we can do is take that variable and we can say dot add event listener. And what this function takes is two things. It takes a argument, which is a type of event. Like you want to indicate what kind of event you're looking for. And in this case, we have click. So, back to the share example, like if I click on this share button, like we could literally attach an event listener to this button and grab its HTML from the DOM. And we could attach an event listener and we could say on click, do this thing called add. And I think just going back to the chat, Dylan asked a question like, when would I store a function in a variable? It would be pretty helpful. It's pretty useful to like store functions and variables and then just give the name of the function. If we did something like add like that, with the brackets, it would immediately execute. And we don't want that. We basically want this add function to execute whenever the click event happens. And so this is a sort of intro to something called callbacks. If you want to learn more about that, at the final slide, I have a list of things that you can sort of go deeper into if you want to. But don't worry too much right now about callbacks. But essentially, we can store a function in a variable and give that variable name to the event listener as an argument. And basically, the gist of it is that when this click event happens, we do add, like we perform that function of adding. And yeah, so I don't know if that's clear, but luckily we have another break for questions. So I'll just wait 1 minute for anybody to ask questions about like the DOM, about events. I will try to answer to the best of my ability. Okay, I guess there's no question. Oh, wait. Okay, you want to see which functions slide? The arrow functions or the first one? The add function. That was this one. Don't worry about the code. I'm actually going to go over the exact code for this add function in my demonstration. So yeah, don't worry about the specific syntax. I'm going to go over the same thing pretty much again. I just wanted to sort of go over it first before showing the demonstration. Okay. Yeah, so let me get on to the sort of the second part of the tutorial. Yeah, so now like I just want you to shift your attention to, let me close this, attention to this HTML, this big block of HTML. And so I want to start with saying like, yeah, Brandon probably showed you a bunch of stuff with HTML and CSS. I think the first most important thing to mention to sort of solidify your guys' understanding is that you may be wondering like, oh, how do you actually use HTML, CSS, and JavaScript together? Well, the answer to that is we can import scripts into our HTML. And so if you see on my ID on the right side of my screen, I actually have two script tags, and inside the script tag, you want to add a source, which is essentially the path to the script file. And yeah, that's pretty much it. And so if you see, I have two script tags, one of which is vendor.js and one of which is app.js. And if you look in my left sidebar, I hope most of you guys have like VS Code or something similar. If you look on the sidebar, you can see inside the scripts folder, I have app.js and vendor.js. And so typically with a vanilla JS application, you have the HTML, and then you have the scripts, which actually does the interactive stuff. Sorry, the interactive stuff. And so once I import both of these two scripts at the very end, we can actually do all of this DOM manipulation stuff that I was showing you. And so I think the easiest way to start this demonstration is just to show you the functionality. And so let's see, let me get this out of the way. Yeah, so I have this calculator, which basically it's very simple. All it does is we can type something in, like say we type in 10. Let's see, we type in 10. And now say we started with 0, and now we type in a number 10, and now say we click on plus. What we wanted to do is add the current number, which is 0, with the number that we just entered. So if we say plus, we get 0 plus 10, and then it spits out the result of that calculation. And so now we have the result of 10. Say I want to add like 7. If I put in the number 7, and I say add, it gets 17. And it's probably pretty predictable what the rest of these things do. We have like subtraction, multiplication, division. And so I'm going to actually go over first of all, like let's just look at the HTML first, and then it'll make more sense how we can deal with the HTML to make it dynamic and interactive. So you're probably familiar with like HTML tags, things like the button tag. So I think the most important thing is the button tags. So if you see this right here, we have 4 buttons, and the ID is button add, button subtract, and button multiply, button divide. And so if you remember a few slides ago in the presentation, I showed how we could like get element by ID, and we could use a unique ID to actually extract an element out of the DOM and basically do something with it, whatever we want. And so here we've defined these 4 unique IDs to each of these buttons. And so each of these buttons in HTML corresponds to one of these buttons on the web page. And also, once again, we have these scripts imported. And so this is sort of the meat of it. Like, if you look at the vendor file, this is where we actually start pulling things out of the DOM. So this is what I did in the console. Basically, we have this, firstly, we have this user input field. And so whenever I type something here, this is going into this input field. And the input field is actually this HTML tag here with the ID called input number. And so what I do is I go to the document, which is the root node of the DOM, and I use that ID to essentially store that into a variable, that node. And I do that with all of these. I do it with the add button, the subtract button, everything, right? And the current result output, which is what we previously had is a calculation, and the current calculation output, which both of these two things will be used in here to put the new result right here at the bottom. And so moving on, let me just comment this stuff out. So basically, what I'm trying to show you, I think the best way to start is just show the event listener stuff. So I showed in the slide a minute ago, like how we could give a name of a function and a event type to an event listener, to an event listener function, and we can really add an event listener to a button, or really any element for that sake, for that matter. And so in this example, we add an event listener to the add button, subtract button, multiply button, the divide button, and respectively, like we give all of these function names to those add event listener functions. I think that should make sense. Like if you look closely, we have the add, subtract, multiply, divide. We have all these functions neatly in this app.js file. And The code is not too important. All it does is it gets the user number input, which is essentially it calls this function. And what this function does is it directly gets that user input field from the DOM that we stored in a variable, and it just parses that string into an integer. That's what parsing does. You don't really need to worry about that. Just know that it turns the string into a number. And then we return that number back to our function so we can use it for processing. And then once we get the number, we literally all we have to do is take our initial result and then perform the mathematical operation. Like for example, for subtract, what we want to do is get what's already in there, and then we want to take what's already in there, and we want to subtract the entered number. And then what we want to do is write that output to the front end. And this create and write output function, I believe, is here. And so don't worry too much about the code. It's actually linked in the GitHub, which I will send out a link to. I guess on Discord, we'll send out a link to that if you want to go over that after as an exercise. But yeah, I think that is a decent explanation of like how we can manipulate the DOM, how we can use functions, and how all of this stuff relates to HTML and CSS. Because I think that is the biggest question that you probably have when you're starting out. And yeah, let's see what else. And yeah, I think that's it. Like, just as a closing note, I have linked a few resources. I guess you guys can't access this, so in Discord we will have to make this available, this presentation. But yeah, I will mention like two very important resources that you will probably find yourself using are the official JS docs and this website called learnjs.org, which was pretty helpful for me for learning the basics. And if you want to get ahead, if you're like really, I'm sure there's a spectrum of you guys here. Like some of you guys are just here because you're curious and like, what is JavaScript? Like, oh, that sounds cool. Like, I want to learn it. Some of you guys probably know it, and like, you probably like know everything I'm saying. So yeah, there's probably a spectrum of you guys here, but I will list these resources regardless, just so you can go off and learn. But I will mention, like, if you do want to get ahead, definitely learn things like async, await, promises, callbacks, destructuring, etc. Like those things will be very crucial when you start using React. So don't worry about it now if you don't have time. But if you do want to get ahead, I would recommend diving into these actual resources and reading up on these concepts. And in these tutorials, we do a little post tutorial like exercise / project. This may be a bit boring. Like if you guys think this is boring, like you can like maybe go think of something else. But I think this is a good thing. A good project would be to just go and sort of try to rebuild what I showed in the calculator. I didn't show the calculator code really in depth, so I suppose you can go and look at the code once or twice if you want to, but I do recommend like then trying to go and build it out from scratch without looking at the code if possible. Just because like when you've already seen the code and the logic, you're going to partially be working from memory and partially be like sort of trying to put the pieces together in your head to like logically string everything together. So while it is a bit boring, I think it would be a good exercise to try to figure out like how the DOM works, how functions work, how like JS works across multiple files, how script imports work, like how it works together with HTML, all of that stuff. So I think this would be a good exercise if you guys are interested. And yeah, I think that's everything for me. If you guys have any more questions, I can just open the floor up now for that. And then and also like if you guys, I'm sorry if you guys couldn't follow along. you can message me on Discord. I'm sure you guys have access to my Discord through the QWeb server. So if you guys are like confused on any of this, I'm sorry about that. Just let me know, and I will try to answer anything. But like regardless, the documentation that I linked will probably be better and is really helpful. So just keep that in mind. Okay, I guess there's no questions. Brandon, do you have any closing thoughts or? Sounds good. Okay, Callum, you said, are we going to work up to including JS in our website project? What do you specifically mean by that? I'm not exactly sure what you did in your first tutorial. Do you want to like unmute yourself? Just so I can understand better what you're asking. Oh, okay.
Hello, can you guys hear me? Awesome.
Okay.
Yeah, so I can definitely take that question.
Okay, I guess we
When it
don't
comes
have any
to,
more questions.
oh
Then,
shit, I guess
so
Bobby can't hear me. That's kind of
yeah, I
sucks.
guess
I'll
thanks
answer
everybody
you
for
after.
coming out. There will be another tutorial, I think on the 12th for React, and that one will be a bit more relevant. So definitely stay tuned for that. That one's very important since everything we're doing in QWeb, I'm pretty sure we'll be using React. So yeah, definitely stay tuned for that. And yeah, I think we'll end that here. We'll end it here.